Okay, you're good.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so we want to establish the central idea of Chapter 2 in A History of Good Ideas. Anybody remember the chapter title? And note I say remember, because that means you've looked at it and can recall. Madison?
Liquid networks.
Liquid networks, yes. So can somebody define what a liquid network is? Don't talk over each other. Be courteous. Colby?
It's an environment where connections can be built and broken freely but not chaotically.
Okay. Everybody hear that?
Yeah.
An environment in which connections can be built and broken but not chaotically, right? Why the word liquid? Unpack that for me, Robert.
Because they're fluid and they can change.
They're fluid and they can change, right? So it's very much about possibility, right? What is possible? What kinds of connections can be made or not made, right? And why network? Why are we so interested in network this time around? Yeah, Bethany?
Because we're talking about creating ideas, and to create ideas you have to have more than one person working.
Okay, because we're talking about creating ideas, and ideas can be germinated by the interactions of more than one person, right? So we're talking about the way individuals, things can connect together to generate new ideas, okay? And one of the things that you'll find as you go throughout your college career is that often some of the most interesting ideas you're going to encounter are when you put things together, right? So, are there any questions about liquid ideas? Yeah. That's what you drink when you've got a paper to write. Hopefully it's got a very low alcohol content. Or it will definitely be interesting. Any questions about liquid networks as a concept before I turn it over to my friend and colleague? Okay, then it is my distinct pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Jessica Luck. She is a professor in the English department who works on contemporary poetry in particular. She works in disability studies and has done some really interesting work with poetry in relation to disability. As I said, I've known her for 20 years. I remember she and her husband high-fiving my oldest son, who's now in college, when he was like 8 months old at an English department party in Indiana. So please help me welcome Dr. Jessica Luck.
Clearly there's some sort of gender bias with these things. Now I'm like, what am I going to do with this? You know, no pockets, very unprepared. Thank you guys. Thank you, first of all, to Professor Marshall for having me today. And thank you guys for being here on a Friday afternoon when I know you're probably pretty worn out after a long week. My plan is to kind of start by letting you guys do some thinking about your own relationship to ideas and networks and liquid networks and that kind of thing. And letting you talk to each other a little bit. And then I'll share some of my research into the science and literature behind the process of creation. So where creativity comes from, what scientists have said about it, but also what poets have said about it, right? Poets have figured things out way before the scientists, as we will see. So I wanted to start with a question that I'm going to have you guys think about for a few minutes on your own. Even though I know it's all about liquid networks, I do think it's important to start maybe thinking a little bit just by yourself, right? So I want you guys to think of a good idea that you've had at some point in your life, okay? It could be something you created, right? That was kind of innovative and new and cool. A problem that you solved in an innovative way, and that could be, you know, something like the garbage can lid was not working, and so whatever. It doesn't have to be something sort of super impressive. Or just a kind of insightful or surprising analysis you know, maybe in a class that you've taken or something like that. So think of one of those things, right? And then I want you guys to think about how that idea came to you, right? Or how you came up with it, depending on how you want to describe the agency there. Did it come to you or did you create it? Who knows? And try to remember some of the messy, convoluted routes, right, that Johnson talks about. You know, he says most people, after they've had a good idea, come up with this really clear narrative. Like, one day I was walking in the, you know, through the trees and I saw this bird and it made me think, oh, you know, migration. Oh, you know, like, so you create this narrative as if the idea just kind of was born out of one moment, one eureka moment, when in fact it's often super messy. So try to think about that. What are the messy ways that you came up with this idea? And then finally, what role did other people play in that emergence, right? Were you brainstorming with other people? Did somebody else kind of ask you a question that really opened it up for you? So I'm going to have you guys write for maybe 2 minutes, just sort of thinking through this stuff. So take a moment. So often when you ask people to think of a really creative or innovative idea that someone had, they often go to the kind of big C creative stuff, right? So they start thinking about Archimedes in his bathtub having that eureka moment where he figured out that his body displaced the amount that was the volume of his body, right? Or Newton sitting under a tree, you know, apocryphally with an apple bonking the theory of gravity into his head, right? Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs coming up with the personal computer, right? So those are sort of big C creative and innovative ideas. But I feel like that kind of, that allows people to go, oh, I'm not creative. I'm just not a creative person, right? But that's not true at all, right? All of us can make all kinds of cool little c creative ideas all the time, and we do it all the time in our classrooms, in our, in boardrooms, in kitchens, in everything that we do, we're coming up with ideas and creating them. And so I wanted to start today by sort of letting you guys think of some of those, and then we're going to test some of Johnson's claims against your own experience with creating these ideas. But first, let's create some liquid networks. So turn to a partner, kind of share what you wrote about. If you didn't finish writing, you can kind of finish brainstorming with them. So, 5 minutes or so, share your idea with each other.
No, I'm already now though. Copy and paste it from here to here. You know
about the idea, but tell us briefly about the idea and then how it came to you, right? And the role of other people in that idea. So, who wants to share an idea with us? Anybody? Okay. People are pointing at you, right? Okay, go for it.
My grandma was getting out of the car, and she has hypermobility syndrome, so her tendons are really stretchy, and her tendons kind of snap. So I thought, what could be a good way to get her in and out of the car? So I got a Lazy Susan, like, the spinny thing.
Yeah.
And I put a cushion on top, and I put fabric on it, and she'll just sit down and twist in the car.
Wow, that's awesome. So what made you think of that? Like, how did that idea come to you?
My grandma was like, oh, if there was something that I could just move into the car with easier, Oh.
That's really cool. I love it, right? And it's like so simple and yet changed her life in such a powerful, meaningful way, That's amazing. That's cool. Now you need to patent it and make a lot of money off of that. Awesome. That seems like maybe more of an individual idea, right? I mean, did you bounce it off somebody else when you were making it or putting it together?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay, all right. But mostly it was you. See, I mean, y'all may have noticed Johnson is against, in some ways, the idea of the kind of genius sitting in his room by himself, coming up with cool ideas. But this student has proven him wrong already. I'm just kidding. Thank you for sharing that. Anybody else want to share or point out one of your peers? Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, so nothing has been solved yet or anything, but
Okay.
I think this could change a lot of lives. And
Okay,
I feel very passionate about this.
Okay.
Okay, so it was 120 degrees outside, and my friend and I decided that we wanted to go get boba. So we got in the car, we drove a half hour to Riverside to go get good boba. And then we were like, you know what, it really sucks that we had to get out of the car in 120 degree weather, go to boba, get back in the car, and it's really, really hot. Because your car's already hot when you get back.
Yeah.
So we're like, this was a terrible thing. So we're like, what can we do to not get out of the car? And we're like, oh my gosh, a drive-through, because those exist.
Right.
So then we're like, okay, drive-through boba, and we call it Goba.
Are you commenting on Gobo? No, I have another one. Okay, let's just all take a moment and appreciate the genius of Gobo. I love it.
I approve.
Now, did you guys come up with that that together?
Yeah, okay, because she was the one who was like, I really didn't want to get out of my car, and then I was like, wow, that's amazing, like, we should have a drive-through for this, and we're like, but we need to have a name, and then I thought of GOBA, because like, if you're on the go,
Yeah.
it just kind of all meshed together, and it was a brilliant plan. I need to go on Shark Tank.
You really did. That's super. I love it. All right, so that's interesting. This one was sort of in the moment. She innovated. She was like, okay, what if we had this? But then you two kind of bounced ideas off each other. Do y'all have friends and relationships like this where you can kind of, it reminds me of improvisation, you know, like comedy in some ways. Like this is sort of funny too, right? You know, like if you're working with someone who's like fun to like bounce ideas off of, you can come up with some really interesting and fun things, right? I mean, as a teacher too, you sort of love it when you have a class full of people who are willing to kind of bounce ideas with you, you know? So it's not just like, I mean, in some ways what Johnson is talking about when he's talking about solid, right, versus liquid networks. A solid network is the single genius sitting in their room, coming up with an idea. It's also a single professor at the front of the room just talking about his or her ideas and not interested at all in what you guys have to say, right? So we want to avoid those things. We want the classroom to be a liquid network as well. Okay, another one.
Mine isn't like glitzy or glamoury, but
That's okay.
it's not as good as GOBA.
No, I don't know if
My
anybody.
church was having this like live event, and I was helping coordinate it, and we had a lot of animals that were on the set for it. And we had like this chicken coop, but the chickens kept escaping, and they were like running around with all the guests, and we kept having to chase them. So I came up with the idea to put curtains on it, so the chickens felt like it was dark outside, so they went to sleep. So then they were there for the event, but they weren't like running around the courtyard destroying things.
Yeah,
So,
that's nice. And what was the sort of the birth of that idea? Where did it
because
come
I was tired of chasing chickens.
from? Where did you gain the knowledge that chickens think it's night when you get dark? Or did
Well, we were like the guy that was coordinating it with me. We were talking about how we could get them to stay, and we were like, maybe we should give them food, or like maybe, you know. And then one of the other ladies I was coordinating with was like, oh, I have chickens, and like if you convince them that it's night, then they'll sleep. And we're like, oh, okay, cool. So we just like stapled like curtains around it,
Yeah.
and
All
I
right.
can't chase chickens anymore.
So again, it was kind of a group effort, right? It's
Yeah.
like we have this problem. What if maybe we'll do this? And someone's like, hey, I know chickens, and then you kind of work together to solve the problem. I like it. I like it. One more, maybe? Anyone? Yeah.
I have another one. Alright, so it's not a bad idea. It's a pretty good idea.
Okay.
So it was.
We will see about that.
It was like during finals week where my group of friends and I, we had to like cram for a final. But instead of studying like all those chapters that we needed to, like, we broke it up into like chapters. Whereas like this one friend, like he like really crammed for that chapter, and like so yeah, each and every single one of us had a chapter, and so we would teach it to each other until like we got it.
That's brilliant. Is everyone writing that down? That is a really good idea. Yeah, so you kind of become the expert, and then you teach the high points to everybody. Therefore, not everyone has to read every single chapter, like again. We hope you read them the first time. But I think that's great. And so, was that someone's idea in the group, or did you guys just kind of
We kind of thought
about it as a group? That's great. That's really cool. Is there any more out there? Cool ideas? Yeah, go ahead.
Alright, so I was working in the lab with a microcentrifuge, which is basically a device that has like 14 or 24 slots and spins stuff really
Yeah.
fast so you can separate them. And the thing about it, you have to have it balanced. So I don't know why, but in our minds we always thought you have to have it even, and so 2, 4, 6, it's always balanced. But we were working with 3 samples, and every single time we had to add like a blank with just water to balance it.
Balance it, right.
And until we kind of thought like it's 24 slots, you could balance it with 3 if you just place them in the right position.
Yeah, right? Because, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but 24 divided by 3 is 8, right? Yeah. I was the math queen in high school. That part of my brain has died now, but I got that. I have a 5-year-old, speaking of creative minds, right? People have talked about the way that young kids, right, like their brains aren't as solidified, right? And they make weird connections and weird metaphors all the time. But my son is weirdly interested in math right now, like, So weirdly I say, lots of people are interested in math, but seems weird to me. When I went into his room he makes me wait 5 minutes and then come in and check on him, monsters and stuff. So I come in and he's sort of it was actually more like 10 minutes. I was a little bit late. And so he's kind of half asleep and sort of dreamy. And he's like, "Mommy, can I ask you a question?" And I was like, "Of course, you know. What is it going to be, right? What is 10 plus 13? And I was like, 23? And he just like got this huge smile on his face and then just rolled over like I had just like sobbed. Like I'd come up with Goba or something. You know, like right now, I'm sure the questions are going to get harder, but right now I really, you know, it was just like the sweetest moment. I have no idea what that was about. But you know, so has anyone had a good idea as a child? Like, you know, like you created something or did something cool? Yeah.
So, well, it's weird because like this idea stuck with me for a very long time. I was in my friend's yard and when I was 8 years old, and I was looking at some ants, and my grandma was there like reading shorts and stuff like that. And I had this like weird idea that like every person's thoughts are someone else's imagination or something. So I was like, I was telling to my grandma that, you know, Grandma, whatever I'm thinking right now is like I've already said it outside. So I'm sorry, I'm phrasing it wrong. Whatever I'm thinking right now, someone else has said it outside, and the words are floating in the air. And whenever I want to think about it, the words just like go inside my ear, and like the words just come out or something like that. Yeah. And then as thinking about it now, I feel like it's just about more. Everyone's thoughts is someone else's imagination.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
I like that. I mean, that's sort of almost a nice statement of what Johnson is saying, right? Like our thoughts are really just like a kind of conglomeration of other people's ideas and imagination. That's really cool. Yeah, that's kind of, that's really good for a, you know, little kid, right? I mean, they say things like, you know, "Ooh, Mommy, the fish are flying," right? And you're like, yeah, the fish swimming in the tank do look like they're flying, you know? And we sort of lose the ability to do that kind of metaphorical stuff later on, right? Yeah, my son made some comment one time about time is at the end of the universe or something. Like, and I was just like, this was when he was 4, and I was like, where did that come from? And apparently I have a new like theoretical physicist like Sheldon on my hands. He seems like not the best, but he's funny anyway. Okay, so for those of you that, you know, I know you don't all have to speak about your ideas, but it seems like this idea that, you know, that of liquid networks, that you kind of bounce ideas off other people, let's just do a show of hands. For all of you, your ideas, how many of you were other people pretty involved in the emergence of your idea? Okay. All right, how many of you was it kind of just you kind of figuring something out on your own? Okay. No, I mean, this is that almost looks like half and half to me, you know? So I don't know, I think I do like that Johnson is making this corrective, right, to kind of deconstruct the idea of the solitary genius. But I also, you know, don't want to make this shift to saying that now all ideas have to be born in networks. You know, like how many of y'all are introverts out there? Introverts? Yeah, me too. There's something about, and maybe y'all feel this in your classes right now, when your teacher's like, okay, now we're going to do some group work, and you're like, oh, you know, do you feel this? I mean, and I took French last year, 101, 102, 103, because keep learning, you know. But yeah, I felt it as a student. I'd be like, to talk to people, you know. But then once I did it, I loved it, and I had fun or whatever, but it's just like, you know, there's this sense that we introverts kind of like to work on our own. And I wanted to point out this book. I don't know if any of you guys have read it. It's by Susan Cain. It's called Quiet. Has anyone read this? You have? Yeah. Do you want to, can you remember any of the?
I just remember it being, for me, because I'm an extrovert, I thought I was an introvert at the time that I read it. And I just remember it being a lot of like explanations of like, here's this box of how you feel versus as opposed to the rest of the world in a sense, and it was sort of how to bring conversations from big grandiose ideas down to like a more personable interpersonal level.
Yeah. I mean, she's worried about, because there is a big shift right now, and it's a good shift, right, of us working together to solve problems, boardrooms, and as you read in Johnson's piece, businesses are sort of doing open floor plans and stuff like that so that people can innovate and talk to each other and stuff like that. But she's interested in there being a kind of balance, and Johnson talks about that too, but she's like, you have ideas, you need some quiet, some time to think, right, to kind of process, and then you take it to the boardroom and kind of have people ask questions and stuff like that. I do this with my husband, who's also a professor in the English department. We play think ball, as we call it. So, I'll have an idea about an article I'm writing or something, and I'll be like, okay, and then I'll do it, right? Basically what we do is we attack each other, our ideas, and so, but it's like I want the idea to be ready before I, subject it to the attack, right, to the think ball, right? So I think that's important, right, this sort of dialectic, right? You do some work on your own, and then you go out and work with other people with your idea. So that was one of the ways that I was, I was sort of, I can tell Stephen Johnson might himself be an extrovert, and so the book Quiet is about, what's the subtitle? The power of introverts in a world that can't stop talking, right? Everybody's always talking, you're like, please stop talking. Which is funny that I'm saying this now. Okay, so now I'd like to share with you guys some of my research that I've done that may complicate Johnson's ideas in interesting ways. So artists, writers, and poets, of course, as I mentioned before, have been thinking about creativity for millennia. Like, where does art come from? There's another science writer named Jonah Lehrer. He wrote a book called Proust Was a Neuroscientist. That's kind of fun, in which he looks at all these different artists, including like a chef. There are like all kinds of people, who basically, he argues, figured out some of the intricacies of the brain that cognitive science is just now starting to name, right? So like Proust figured out how memory works, a century before the cognitive scientists did. But one place that creative ideas can come from for us as academics and thinkers is when we borrow and learn from different domains, right? Things outside our comfort zone or expertise, like math, right, for me. Maybe for you, it's poetry, right? One of the problems with the current university system in America is that faculty often end up in silos, right? And by that we mean, I'm in the English department and I do my English thing. I have no idea what they're doing over in psychology or sociology or what have you. And so we don't get that fertile cross-pollination that Johnson is talking about, right? You as students, though, are lucky because we force you in our curriculum at Cal State to take classes in lots of different things. And so I hope you guys take advantage of that, right? I know that sometimes when you're looking at your GE classes and you're like, oh my God, I don't like this, I don't like that, and you feel like you're just checking off a box. Like, I'll just take the class and I'll finish it. But I think these classes, instead of seeing them as just annoying, think of them as helping you to create liquid networks, right? Stimulating innovation in your ways of thinking in the disciplines you are excited about, and maybe even in your own life, right? So my disciplinary expertise is in contemporary poetry, as Professor Marshall said, but I've always been fascinated in research about the brain. So I used to read books, I still do, read books about the brain for fun, I thought. But this is actually how I came up with the idea for the book that I'm working on right now. I was reading Antonio Damasio. Does anyone know this guy? He's a cognitive neuroscientist who writes popular books about the brain and consciousness and emotion. When I was reading his book, The Feeling of What Happens, I noticed that every time he came to a really knotty, difficult thing to explain about consciousness, like he was like, it's kind of like T.S. Eliot said. Like he kept quoting poems to help describe what he was describing about the brain. And so I thought to myself, is there something about the genre of poetry itself that lends itself to explaining really complicated things about the brain and the workings of the embodied mind? And so I turned to the poetry to find out. So sometimes coming up with a good idea is just coming up with a good question, So today I thought I'd share just a brief example of what can emerge from this fruitful pairing of poetics and cognitive science. And I want you guys to notice the ways that I work to put the poetry and science in dialogue. One of the things that I have a problem with is, oh, it's all about STEM these days, right? The humanities are kind of, they call us fruity over there. But I don't want it to be like the science is the truth, capital T, that we then use to dissect the poems. I think the poets are also theorizing about consciousness in really powerful ways that the scientists can also learn from. So I think about the poets that I write about as co-theorizers about cognition, emotion, embodied cognition, and creativity. So, the poet Harriet Mullen is who I'm going to talk about today. Has anyone heard of her? She's from Southern California. She's at UCLA. She's a professor at UCLA. This book, Sleeping with the Dictionary, was nominated for the National Book Award in 2002. And this book offers a kind of theory, I argue, of where poems, and in a broader sense, creative ideas come from. Her theory offers an interesting extension and perhaps even critique of Johnson's theory of liquid networks that we read for today. Johnson seems to create, to me, a bit of a rigid binary in his argument, right? Working and thinking by yourself, you are a solid and you're stuck in your own brain, right? Only when working with others does that solid break into an innovative liquid network. I feel like that's a bit of a rigid binary that needs deconstructing. But Mullen's poems, as well as contemporary brain science, reveal the ways that our brains themselves, even within the brain, are liquid networks on the inside. And there are ways to stimulate creativity and innovation by breaking up those rigid routes all by yourself, including dreams, listening to your inner voices, playing around with language, and paradoxically, as we'll see, applying constraints to your ways of thinking. So these are some of the things she theorizes in this book. The title poem of Sleeping with the Dictionary so the title of the poem is also called Sleeping with the Dictionary. It seems to theorize this solitary but innovative act of creation, imagining the act of writing the poem as an event, a complex, dynamic, but unified process out of which the poem emerges. This creative event, as the gerund of the title suggests, incorporates both the push of a deluge of language, represented by the dictionary, and the pull of the poet's own body and mind. The phrase sleeping with implies both the influence of the unconscious mind, right, what's happening in your dreams, and the bodily act of sexual intercourse. I'll show you the poem in a second. It's kind of, I call it dictionary porn. So for Mullen, body, mind, and language are all inextricably linked in the emergent event of poetic creation. All of those things are working together. So I'm going to tell you guys about one cognitive theory that I've also read about that I thought was super interesting for understanding that interaction of mind, body, and language. And that's the mind's inner voice, or inner speech. And I think you guys probably know what I'm talking about there, right? It's the talking that kind of goes on in our heads, right? The intermittent but persistent voices that go on in the mind that we hear with a kind of inner ear. In some ways then, we have Johnson's productive conference table inside our brains, right? In an interdisciplinary essay on this phenomenon, Denise Riley explains that because of inner speech, we are all, to a certain degree, schizophrenics in a perpetual state of mild possession. She says that the disease, schizophrenia, comes when you realize you think those voices are not coming from inside your head. But the rest of us walk around with voices in our head all the time. We know that there are voices, right? So we're kind of owned by the voices streaming in our heads. The experience of the inner voice is thus often passive. Riley characterizes it as a kind of ventriloquy, a sense that one is a vehicle for words spoken from elsewhere. Yet despite our possession by these voices from elsewhere, we do maintain some agency in the face of the onslaught of language in the mind. We can react to it by ignoring it, or disagreeing with certain linguistic arrivals, or by affirming them. Riley claims the capacity to write is therefore, quote, far more of a capacity to edit than it is to originate. Like really what you're doing is just editing those voices that are in your mind. The act of editing the inner voice, whether for verbal or written communication, is thus both passive and active and constituted by forces both inside and outside the subject herself. Finally, the phenomenon of the inner voice is not simply a kind of semiotic soup that denies the presence of the body and its senses, for the inner voice implies an inner ear with which we hear it. As Riley asserts, meditating on inner speech throws us hard back on the materiality of words, the oral qualities of the voices we hear in our heads. Thus, the poetic interpreter of the inner voice is possessed not only by its semiotic signs, but also by the sonority of its sounds. Lots of S's there. Mullen's conflation of the influences of mind, body, and the sounds and semiotics of language into a single phrase, sleeping with the dictionary, suggests that separating out the parts of the creative event is an impossible task, and perhaps beside the point. The act of creation is a kind of experiential confound, as philosopher of science Brian Massumi describes it, in which all the parts work together to form a gestalt. He usefully theorizes the notion of a confound as it relates to the creation of visual art, explaining that our experience of color is a confound, for it can't be separated from our experience of brightness. Let me paraphrase Massumi's example, which he borrows from the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. So while looking at objects on my desk, I can easily state what color things are, right? You know, this is white, this is yellow, this is blue. But if I look more carefully, I notice that colors shift depending on their proximity to the light. Though my desk is a light shade of brown, it looks much darker under the computer monitor and almost white where the lamp strikes it directly. If I was asked to match these colors on a color wheel, I couldn't do it. I can't separate the color from the brightness I perceive. So our visual perception is thus a confound, an unsplittable relationality, according to Massumi. If you do try to split the experiential confound of its relations through the process of analysis, it becomes something else entirely. Even synthesis, too, requires first that you dissociate the parts and then reassemble them against the backdrop of your own generalized and reductive understanding of the experience. Massumi's example offers a caveat to my own analysis of the creative event and confirms what poets have suggested about the creative process itself. It's not a detached, objective, poet-centered process, but an integrated, experienced emergence, an event. So if the poet is not an analyzer or a synthesizer of information, what does she do? Massumi's explanation of the visual artist's activity is worth quoting at length. So here's what he writes about. What does she do? Yielding to the complexity of variation, the artist's activity joins the confound. The artist's activity becomes one of the encompassed variations of the confound. The artist can still act, but her action is more an experimental tweaking of an autonomous process than a molding of dumb matter. The artist joining the confound helps catalyze a particular co-emergence of color, illumination, form, and space-time. This is still a creative process, all the more so because it modulates an actual emergence. So the artist's role then is catalyst. If we shift Massumi's description from the creation of visual art to the creation of poetry, then the creative event looks something like this. The poet's inner voices, composed of oral and semiotic information from inside and outside, most prominently the dictionary in Mullen's case, along with the dreams and visions of the unconscious mind and the bodily experience of language, create what I'm calling a linguistic confound, the unsplittable relationality of the poet's embodied experience of language. The poet yields to the push of these multiple influences, but also adds her own activity to the mix, an experimental tweaking of this overdetermined confound through which the poem emerges. Okay, so let's turn to the poem. Oh, there it goes. So this may look more like a paragraph to some of you, and that's because it's what's known as a prose poem. But as you'll see, when we read it, it's, that sounds kind of like an oxymoron, right? But you'll see as we read it that it's definitely more poetic than it is than a paragraph. So let me read the poem, and then I'll show you guys my analysis of it, what I think her theory is here. You're going to notice, I said a minute ago that I call this poem like an example of dictionary porn. There's a lot of what I call passionate puns in here, words that kind of have double meanings with very sexual connotations. So y'all are all grown-ups, but just, if anybody needs to go, you can You can head out. I shouldn't say that. You're going to be like, oh, look at the times. You're suddenly going to become very moralistic. Sex and poetry, horrible. Okay, so anyway, this is her poem. Okay, she writes. Okay, sleeping with the dictionary. I beg to dicker with my silver-tongued companion, whose lips are ready to read my shining gloss. A versatile partner, conversant and well-versed in the verbal arts, the dictionary is not averse to the solitary habits of the curiously wide-awake reader. In the dark night's insomnia, the book is a stimulating sedative, awakening my tired imagination to the hypnagogic trance of language. Retiring to the canopy of the bedroom, turning on the bedside light, taking the big dictionary to bed, clutching the unabridged bulk, heavy with the weight of all the meanings between these covers, smoothing the thin sheets, thick with accented syllables. All are exercises in the conscious regimen of dreamers who toss words on their tongues while turning illuminated pages. To go through all these motions and procedures, groping in the dark for an alluring word, is the poet's nocturnal mission. Aroused by our nightly act, the penetration of the denotative body of the work. Any exit from the logic of language might be an entry in a symptomatic dictionary. The alphabetical order of this ample block of knowledge might render a dense lexicon of lucid hallucinations. Beside the bed, a pad lies open to record the meandering of migratory words. In the rapid eye movement of the poet's night vision, this dictum can be decoded, like the secret acrostic of a lover's name. All right, this is a great book. I recommend it. It's a good introduction to experimental poetry. So let me help explain some of this a little bit. So the poem begins with its own confound of body, poet, and language. I beg to dicker with my silver-tongued companion, whose lips are ready to read my shining gloss. Mullen stresses the inextricable connection between language and embodiment. The dictionary, which is often a representation of how signs are detached from their signifiers in the real world, right? There's like, why is this called a table when it's called a mesa in Spanish, or le table in French, right? Like, there's just kind of random, right, that we name things, the words that we name them. But here the dictionary is anthropomorphized. It's given a body with a tongue and lips. Elsewhere in the book, Mullen writes, I've been licked all over by the English tongue. And here too, the poet's body and the body of the dictionary are ambiguously mingled. Instead of the poet reading the dictionary's lips, here the dictionary's lips are reading the poet's shining gloss, suggesting both the gloss on her lips, but also the gloss of a dictionary entry, as if her body is constituted by both flesh and language itself. This fleshy connection is underscored in the poet's verb choice to dicker. She also, of course, as you can tell, is playing on the male anatomy in several of these words, but we're not going to go there. So to dicker, which means to haggle, bargain, or barter, but it originally came from the fur trade, meaning a quantity of 10 hides or skins. The poet's role of dickering with the dictionary implies a kind of give and take, right? I mean, in some ways, the dictionary and her are like a liquid network, right? A combination of mastery and being mastered by the linguistic confound she encounters in her companion. But this bargaining is also a transaction of and within the flesh. The 10 skins of her dickering are ultimately reflected in the 10 sentences of the poem itself, which is the product of a catalysis of the tongue and lips and gloss of the body of the poet and the body of the dictionary. Throughout the poem, Mullen figures this mingling of the body of language and her own body as a kind of sexual encounter. The line retiring to the canopy of the bedroom, right? It's sort of, you know, it's very, it's like a bodice-ripping romance novel or something, except it's this woman holding her giant dictionary. I heard in an interview, Harriet Mullen says this poem was inspired by waking up in the middle of the night with the big dictionary poking her in the back. So she actually does sleep with the dictionary. So in her meticulous unfolding of gerund phrases here, right, clutching the unabridged book, smoothing the thin sheets, groping in the dark, she clasps the bulky body of her heavy partner, smooths his skin, which seems to bristle with a manly hairiness of accented syllables, and she even begs him to talk dirty to her. Though this, dare I say, dictionary porn is quite humorous, it also emphasizes a more serious point for Mullen. the ways that language penetrates our bodies and the heteroglossia of our inner voices, and in the resonation of its sounds and the feeling of its movements as we speak it. Words are not abstract entities for Mullen, but have heft and flesh. Thus, the writer's mission is groping for words, not only with her mind, but with her entire body. I do that sometimes, right? I'm trying to think of a word, then I'll sort of literally I'll be like, you know, it's like you're groping for it, right? Because the writer's body and the dictionary's body are of the same species, so to speak, their nightly coupling can be a productive one. Her nocturnal mission also implies a nocturnal emission. Mullen suggests that poetry is the product of this catalytic coupling through her play on the word verse. A versatile partner, conversant and well-versed in the verbal art, the dictionary is not averse to the solitary habits of the curiously wide-awake reader, she says. The Latin word vertere, to turn, is at the root of all these verse words, versatile, conversant, well-versed, averse. The poet's active turning of the pages of the dictionary is what makes her partner so versatile and conversant. And she also describes her actions as a habit, which implies a kind of compulsive bodily repetition on her part. Mullen thus also highlights the importance of habit and even exercises to creativity. Of the list of gerund phrases above, she explains that all are exercises in the conscious regimen of dreamers who toss words on their tongues while turning illuminated pages. To go through all these motions and procedures is ultimately the poet's mission. The model of inspiration that emerges here is far from metaphysical, though. The poet does not passively wait for the muse's voice to speak through her. Instead, she goes through a regimen of exercises and procedures from which a poem might emerge. The embodied valence of these terms is certainly intentional on Mullen's part. These are not just mental exercises, but embodied motions and procedures that involve touching and turning pages, tossing words on tongues, and groping in the dark for an alluring word. Mullen's foreplay/wordplay that I cited earlier culminates in another reference to a regimented practice. Aroused by myriad possibilities, we try out the most perverse positions in the practice of our nightly act, the penetration of the denotative body of the word. Part of the mastery of poetic creation, and perhaps any creation, involves the poet's own techne, her making and shaping of language. But this techne necessitates some techniques, right? As Mullen suggests here, mental and bodily procedures or practices, even positions that generate creative thought. The poet's exercises and procedures depicted here reflect the importance of constraints to creative thought. And this, in some ways, seems to go against Johnson's idea about, it's all about liquidity and movement and change, right? Margaret A. Bowden, who's a cognitive scientist, wrote this book, The Creative Mind, and one of her main theses in the book is that constraints, far from being opposed to creativity, make creativity possible. This seems like counterintuitive to some extent. But I think if you think about it for a minute, you'll come to understand this, right? So, like, sometimes I'll have students write poems in my class, right? Have some creative activities. But if I were to say to you guys right now, write a poem, you would feel sort of lost, right? And you would probably write a really shitty poem. But if I said to all of you, write a zombie haiku, I would get some really cool poems, right? So I gave you a constraint, and then you're like, okay, I need 17 syllables, 575, I have to have a lot of zombie imagery and lots of, like shuffling or whatever. Does that make sense? So a constraint actually helps launch something creative. It also makes me think about, I don't know if y'all watch some of these shows, but like Top Chef or Project Runway, where they often give the artists, a constraint, right? You have to make a dessert, but you can only use whatever is in this vending machine, right? And then they come up with really cool stuff that they never would have come up with outside of that constraint, right? And sometimes, like Tim Gunn says at one point, sometimes they come up with a disco diaper and it doesn't work. But it's still kind of, like they tried, right? And that constraint creates something really cool. Does that make sense? So constraint actually can launch something creative, right? Part of it might be that it has to do with that randomizing that Johnson talks about, right? That helps launch creativity when you kind of breaks you out of your usual ruts because you're like, okay, I have to make a whole outfit only out of newspaper, like they had to do on Project Runway one time. So Mullen's habitual practices, like the disciplinary maps that Bowden talks about, can have powerful generative abilities for the event creation. Mullen cites the constraint of alphabetization as one helpful generative procedure in the poem. Let me go back to that. She writes, the alphabetical order of this ample block of knowledge might render a dense lexicon of lucid hallucinations. It is in part the constraint of a particular order procedure that renders or generates creative ideas in their dense lexicon. The book Sleeping with a Dictionary itself is an example of this rendering. It's a kind of ordered lexicon or dictionary itself. All of the poems are in alphabetical order, but a dense one, crowded with different forms and sounds and meanings, and demanding concentration from its readers. The lexicon of the book itself is made up of the products of these creative exercises and events, or as Mullen oxymoronically describes them, lucid hallucinations. The event of creative thought is both rational, clear, and irrational, a seemingly false perception dredged up from the depths of the unconscious. A lucid hallucination is a good way to describe the chemist Friedrich von Kekulé's irrational dream of a snake biting its own tail that generated a rational theory of how carbon atoms combine. Mullen's theorizing of the creative event, however, moves beyond Bowden's more brain-centered cognitive models of constraints to emphasize the role of the whole embodied cognitive system. Mullen deliberately chooses words that have both exclusively mental and bodily connotations to them. An exercise is something you could do in a class, right? It's a mental exercise, but it's also something you do over at the rec center, right? I'm not sure when you would do that, but I'm doing it right now. A position, right? You take a position on how your beliefs about the government shutdown right now, right? But a position is also like you can assume tree pose, right? So yeah, the acts of groping and penetration, people can make a penetrating remark, right? But that word also has a very physical connotation as well. Being aroused, mental and bodily, right? You can be an arousing speaker, right? But then you can be aroused in other ways. So Bowden's favorite examples of creative thought in her book are Archimedes' Eureka moment in the bathtub, Kekulé's dream by the fire, and Henri Poincaré's mathematical discovery as he was boarding a bus. These stories lead her to speculate about the role of constraining thought processes in the unconscious in this event. But what about the role of the thinker's body itself? In Sleeping with the Dictionary, Mullen suggests that the positions, exercises, and movements of the creative thinker's body are also important in these events. A body resting by a fire, a body boarding a bus, a body taking a bath. Surely those bodily positions and practices, all of them just kind of habitual, right? They're just sort of doing their everyday routine, also play a role in the thinker's mental positions and practices and the ideas they generate. Mullen even suggests trying out perverse positions to stimulate creative events. Perverse, note the play on the word verse again, literally means turned away from normal. These perverse positions can, of course, be mental, as when Kekulé turned away from the position in his discipline of chemistry that molecules must combine in strings only, right? He dreamed of that snake biting his tail. It was like, what if the string, it's not a string, but a ring? And now, organic chemistry was changed forever. But why not also try out a new body position to experience the world, or consider a problem in a new sensory way? If the brain and its cognitive processes are as inextricably embedded in the body and its processes as modern neuroscience suggests, then Mullen's theory here seems quite plausible and intuitive to me anyway. I know that nothing helps me dislodge a mental block better than getting up out of my chair and taking a walk, right? I think if you ever get stuck, stop looking at that computer screen and go do something else, or go do yoga, or whatever. So these positions and procedures, both mental and bodily, both habitual and perverse, that Mullen enacts in her nightly ritual, serve to stimulate creative thought. The final sentences of the poem highlights the way that these constraints set the creative event in motion. Beside the bed, she writes, a pad lies open to record the meandering of migratory words. I recommend doing this. Do y'all ever have like eureka moments in the middle of the night? Like, have something and write it down, just like but then sometimes you like look at it the next morning, you're like, yeah, that doesn't actually make sense. Right? Yeah. And it seems like eventually that could be like a horror film or something. Like it's like, that's not my handwriting, you know. Possessed by someone. So she writes, in the rapid eye movement of the poet's night vision, this dictum can be decoded like the secret acrostic of a lover's name. Like a brook whose contours and meanderings are shaped by the landscape around it, Mullen's creative thinking is shaped by the constraints within her own embodied consciousness, within the language system itself, and by those that she imposes on it from without. Her choice of the word migratory is also helpful for understanding the creative event as an emergent phenomenon. A migratory flock of birds has no leader or center. Have you guys seen some of those murmurations? They're so cool. Like I saw one in the sky in Redlands the other day. It was just, whoa. So there's not any bird that's going, you go there, you go there, you go there, right? They just sort of are following these instinctual rules. So similarly, the poet's nighttime practices precipitate the emergence of a shifting flock of words. Look at that, I made a pun. Out of the linguistic confound of the dictionary and of her own inner voices. Thus, the poet's rapid eye movement can be understood as her eyes' quick saccades, you know that word, you know the way your eyes kind of twitch as you read, as they read the words of the dictionary, but also as her eyes' movements during REM sleep, right? Which is, of course, when dreaming occurs. The creative event emerges from the multiple influences of the language system, the poet's passive submission to the push of her body and unconscious mind, and her active tweaking and shaping or simple recording of the dictums of these influences on the pad by the bed. So, to conclude, Mullen's theory of poetic inspiration that emerges in Sleeping with a Dictionary ultimately confirms the long-held belief that the poet is a possessed creature who often feels as if her poems are being spoken from elsewhere. Mullen complicates this metaphysical model, however, suggesting that poetic inspiration emerges from the complexity of the body itself. Her play with constraints reflects cognitive scientists' claims that constraints are what make creative thought possible, yet Mullen's model expands this abstract mental notion of constraint to include the positions and exercises of the whole system of the body as potentially generative of creative thought. She suggests that the body's biological, cognitive, and sensory structures and systems also function as constraints that engender and give shape to artistic expression. Her poems ultimately embody a theory of liquid poetic emergence from the constraints of a body possessed in the flesh by language itself. So thank you guys for your attention. I wanted to show you one more quote that I just, when I was sort of, my own inner voices spoke to me as I was reading this piece, and so I had to show you guys this one. This is a quote from Stephen Johnson, and I felt like somebody needs to maybe email this to the president. Dear Mr. Trump, environments that build walls tend to be less innovative in the long run than more open-ended environments. So, I just wanted to end on that note.
All right, before you duck out of here, give her another round of applause. We have all kinds of honor swag for Professor Luck. Okay, y'all go have a good long weekend. Hey, it's customary to spend Martin Luther King Jr. Day doing some community service. So maybe consider that.